Hello and welcome to Read. Today I want to talk about Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, her 1949 sort of a landmark anthropological survey of what it means and meant to be a woman, and it was a really foundational text for a lot of second wave feminism and so on and so forth. Before we get started, some quick housekeeping for anyone who's seen the channel. As you can obviously tell, I have moved house. I don't have the kind of nice big bookshelf in the background anymore, which is a little bit of a shame, and there is also this kind of mirror that's doing its thing, which I kind of like it. It's kind of weird because there's a kind of degree of it being exposing because you usually are just seeing the presenter like front on, and it's a very kind of composed look at their face, but then you can see, you know, my behind, but then also in the kind of display screen I can see what that looks like, so I'm also half conscious of what the back of myself looks like, so now it's not really as exposing as it seems, which is kind of cool. It's getting into a little bit of a universe plurum, like knowing that I'm being candidly observed vibe. But anyway, yeah, it will just thought I'd mention that I'd moved houses. So yeah, I might a little bit later or just in another video talk about, you know, what books I brought and so on. But yeah, for now, we'll jump in and we'll talk about de Beauvoir's The Second Sex. I've spent about a month reading this, and we've officially reached peak YouTube content because we're going to have a young bearded man talk about feminism for about half an hour. But yeah, I'll just talk about the experience of like why I wanted to read it, how the book's laid out, some sections that I think or how the book aged, which is really interesting. But then I have, you know, like I took a bunch of notes as I always try to, and I'll just read some extracts from the book. So in terms of what inspired reading it or what made me want to read it, it's like I've owned this book for ages, and it's the sort of book that just sits on your shelf, and I thought to myself, I'm like, hey, I respect women. I care about women's rights. I don't actually have to slog through and read this nearly 800-page tome, do I? Because it's just going to be telling me a bunch of things that I already know. And in a sense, that is part of the experience of reading it. Like, so much of what has become common knowledge nowadays was really just you know, still pretty revolutionary when de Beauvoir was writing it. And Amy Hungerford talks about a similar thing where, like with Thomas Pynchon's The Crying of Lot 49, how our interpretation of the main character, Oedipa Maas, has changed ever since the women's rights movement. But yeah, like, you know, I ended up deciding that no, I didn't. No, I do actually have to read it, or I do want to read it at least. And the experience of reading it was interesting because it felt like half of the book, and not like a solid chunk, but just like every other paragraph, like, or every other section, half of the book is still so relevant and so prescient that you could just pull quotes out of it and use it to respond to arguments that are still showing up today, you know, 75 years after the book was written. But then, on the other hand, you would read some sections that is like, I don't know any man or woman who still thinks like this or still has these thoughts. And obviously, I'm not saying that means that like oppression has gone away, but it's just a lot of the ideas when she gets into talking about kind of like the phallus as manifested transcendence and whatnot. I think that and we'll talk about this when we get a little bit to the end of the book, where she talks about women wanting to be writers and wanting to be creatives, where I feel like a lot of that has actually just translated nowadays to being, you know, anyone trying to create art in this sort of like in a modern world. But yeah, that was sort of the experience, and it was still crazy to see things like quotes that are repeated verbatim and arguments to or you know like answers or justifications for arguments that are still being said today, versus like, wow, this is really a product of its time. And you know, even though there are still you know, women who do adopt the like the traditional gender roles or whatever, it's like the way that it's talked about in this book and the way that it probably was at the time was like, you know, so much more enforced, to the point where you would just be like any man that I talk to would kind of be ashamed to openly admit that they still thought like this. But whether or not they're covertly thinking that they think like this is another story. It's also funny to see because oh gosh, a little earthquake. It's also funny because recently I succumbed to the sin of scrolling Facebook and clicking on just recommended feed where you see some absolutely egregious memes, and then there was one meme that came up that was just like a basic kind of need to make things equal, and looking through the comments section and men women saying women can do everything that men do, and then comments saying like, oh yeah, can women pee standing up? And I'm just like, what? Like, is peeing standing up the thing that you value so highly in human existence that you're going to think that it has any metric or of worth above another person? But just seeing these things happen today, and of course it's online, so there's the chance of it being trolls, and then there's also the chance of people kind of succumbing to a caricature because they are, they have a form of incognito or identity. But yeah, just crazy thinking about 75 years ago, de Beauvoir was talking about peeing standing up, and it's still showing up nowadays. But anyway, let's get started. We'll talk about a couple of general notes before I jump into reading extracts. It seems like the layout of the book is that we start with a kind of scientific and anthropological literature review, and then de Beauvoir moves into talking about just the lived experience of the woman, starting from birth and then leading up to maturity and old age. And then she kind of ends with talking about where to go from there and how to try to move on and to become an independent woman, which sort of reminded me of Bertrand Russell ending his history of Western philosophy with the branch of philosophy that he was studying. And it was a little bit like de Beauvoir was saying, people need to be like me, which, maybe fair enough, but then also maybe some of the sections of the book have aged a little sourly in light of, abuse allegations from de Beauvoir. But anyway, one lucky last thing that I'll mention before going on and talking about extracts is that I actually saw Simone de Beauvoir's grave. She's buried in Montparnasse Cemetery in France, and she is buried with Jean-Paul Sartre. And one of the things that I liked when I went and saw that, not just that grave, but it was something that I only really saw in France, was that one of the things people do is when they go and see people in graves, and I saw, Samuel Beckett and Julio Cortázar and so on, but when they go and see these famous people, they usually leave their public transport tickets on top of the grave, and they just have a little rock resting on top of it. So it's a kind of nice little sign that you've made the pilgrimage to see this person's grave. And it's a cute thing, and I'll put up some pictures of Simone de Beauvoir's grave, where some people have kind of sort of graffitied feminine signs and signals on it, but yeah, just thought I'd quickly mention that anecdote before I move on. Let's get started. I've got a couple of extracts to read. Some of them are going to a lot of them are going to give a taste of just how de Beauvoir writes, and some of them are just going to be kind of food for thought or springboards for me talking about other things. So here's one from the introduction. The introduction, she really just nails and encapsulates a lot of the ideas and a lot of the kind of quotables that will show up. And then later on, of course, as expected, she dives a little bit deeper and moves into things. But this is one of the core thesis of her. Oh, her core thesis is essentially that the fundamental problem with the way that society, I'm just going to say was, because obviously it's up for debate as to whether we've kind of accomplished or moved on from the things that she's talked about. It's obviously not the same, but it's also the idea of an equal society is kind of being thrown into question. So yeah, I'm just going to say is to acknowledge the ambiguity. But her thesis or idea is that The problem is that women are fundamentally set up as an other, and they are kind of relegated to immanence, whereas men, like man is assumed as the default state of being for a human, and he is sort of awarded transcendence. And so the only way in which women can or were able to justify their life or the existence, the whole basis of their life was in context and in relation to a man. And that comes up, pretty much throughout the whole book. And I'll read a quick example. A man never begins by positing himself as an individual of a certain sex. That he is a man is obvious. The categories masculine and feminine appear as symmetrical in a formal way on town hall records or identification posters. The relation of the two sexes is not that of two electrical poles. The man represents both the positive and the neuter to such an extent that in French, homme designates human beings, the particular meaning of the word vir being assimilated into the general meaning of the word homo. Woman is the negative to such a point that any determination is imputed to her as a limitation without reciprocity. And then again, just summarizing like that line that I just said, which was, this is the fundamental characteristic of woman. She is the other at the heart of a whole whose two components are necessary to each other. My boy Montaigne, the great proto-feminist, he shows up, makes an appearance quite often in this book, and he writes, women are not wrong at all when they reject the rules of life that have been introduced into the world, inasmuch as it is men who have made these without them. And then again, like this is just like line after line of things that still show up today, and you could just use it to respond to ridiculous arguments. But in both cases, the ruling caste bases its argument on the state of affairs it created itself. The familiar line from George Bernard Shaw sums it up. The white American relegates the black to the rank of shoeshine boy and then concludes that blacks are only good for shining shoes. And then let's just kind of point some fingers at the people who are fans of the Andrew Tates of the world. No one is more arrogant towards women, more aggressive or more disdainful than a man anxious about his own virility. Those who are not threatened by their fellow men are far more likely to recognize women as a counterpart. But even for them, wait for the plane. That's a new thing. I might even keep this one in, but I'm going to have to edit them out in the future. The area that I'm living is right underneath the kind of flight zone. So yeah, that's just a new thing I have to deal with. But picking back up, but even for them, the myth of the woman, of the other, remains precious for many reasons. They can hardly be blamed for not wanting to lightheartedly sacrifice all the benefits they derive from the myth. Talking about Freud, Freud assumes that a woman feels like a mutilated man, but the notion of mutilation implies comparison and valorization. Many psychoanalysts accept today that girls miss having a penis without assuming they were ever stripped of one. This regret is not even generalized among all girls, and it could not arise from a simple anatomical encounter. Many little girls discover the masculine constitution very late, and if they do discover it, it is only by seeing it. The boy has a living experience from his penis that allows him to take pride in it, but this pride has no immediate correlation with the humiliation of his sisters, since they only know the masculine organ in its exteriority. This growth, this delicate stalk of skin, can only inspire their indifference and even disgust. The girl's envy, when it appears, is the result of a prior valorization of virility. And again, points and arguments that come up today ad nauseum, where, of course, if you're in the extremes of being like a Navy SEAL, the difference between masculine and feminine strength does matter. But, de Beauvoir says, again, reiterating 75 years ago, thus, operating many modern machines requires only a part of masculine resources. If the necessary minimum is not superior to women's capacities, she becomes man's work equal. And then, of course, it's just the most hilarious thing to talk about men being masculine when their job is going to work and click-clacking on a keyboard for 8 hours a day, as though that is embodying the full extent of their testosterone-fueled form. Although totalitarian or authoritarian regimes may all try to ban psychoanalysis and declare that personal emotional conflicts have no place for citizens loyally integrated into the community, eroticism is an experience where individuality always prevails over generality. And that's something that I think, or I thought about it and I highlighted it because I recently read Eileen Cheng's Naked Earth, which, although I didn't love the book, I still felt like I saw why talking about sexuality and the like kind of erotic experience was one of the important things that happened, growing up in the Cultural Revolution. And then maybe a way to understand why things are kind of coming back, or why we're having a unfortunate loop or cycle in anti-feminine rhetoric. It is when woman is probably the most emancipated that the inferiority of her sex is proclaimed, a remarkable example of the male justification process already discussed. When her rights as girl, wife, or sister are no longer limited, she is refused equality with men because of her sex. The pretext for persecuting her becomes imbecility and fragility of the sex. And so de Beauvoir was also, I think, pretty kind of famously or staunchly atheist, and she has some absolute zingers against it, where she writes here, in a religion where the flesh is cursed, the woman becomes the devil's most fearsome temptation. This was something that blew my mind, and maybe that's just me not knowing statistics or not knowing how it is nowadays, but she wrote that in France, every year 800,000 to 1 million abortions are performed, which is as many births. If there's anything that this book has convinced me, it's that I need to buy and read some Stendhal as soon as possible, because he writes here, all the geniuses who are born women are lost for the public good. If truth be told, and now this is de Beauvoir, if truth be told, one is not born but becomes a genius, and the feminine condition has, until now, rendered this becoming impossible. Another really prescient criticism that she makes is talking about how the value of virginity in women is sort of grossly exaggerated in the positive for when they are young, but as soon as they become older, it's kind of grossly exaggerated in the negative. And she writes, but virginity only has this sexual attraction when allied with youth. Otherwise, its mystery reverts to disquiet. Many men today are sexually repulsed by older virgins. Psychological reasons alone do not explain why old maids are regarded as bitter and mean matrons. The curse is in their very flesh, this flesh that is object for no subject, that no desire has made desirable, that has bloomed and wilted without finding a place in the world of men. Turned away from her destination, the old maid becomes an eccentric object, as troubling as the incommunicable thinking of a madman. Oh, and here's another great zinger against Christianity, where she's talking about giving Jesus the virgin birth. Christianity's repugnance for the feminine body is such that it consents to doom its God to an ignominious death, but spares him the stain of birth. Poetry attempts to capture that which exists above everyday prose. Woman is an eminently poetic reality, since man projects onto her everything he is not resolved to be. Man is not wholly devoted to the good he constructs and attempts to impose. He maintains a shameful connivance with the bad, but whenever the bad imprudently dares to show its face openly, he goes to war against it. In the darkness of night, man invites woman to sin, but in the light of day he rejects sin and her, the sinner. And women, sinners themselves in the mysteries of the bed, show all the more passion for the public worship of virtue. Which is kind of showing up. I reckon that was a kind of important thing for Alistair Gray writing Poor Things. Oh man, so I love this. There's a section in this book where she's going through sort of literary takes on what it means to be a woman, and she's talking about some authors, and the first one she talks about is a man named Montalant, who really just seems like the worst person ever, and who held some really again, like Andrew Tate-esque views on like the superiority of men and the domination of women. But de Beauvoir writes, it is easy to believe one is sovereign when alone, to believe oneself strong when carefully refusing to bear any burden. Montalant had chosen ease. He claims to worship difficult values, but he seeks to attain them easily. And another core thesis of de Beauvoir is saying that the problem with the way that we kind of fantasize the feminine qualities is that when we actually look at them, we realize that a lot of it is like smoke and mirrors. And she talks about this where she says, "It is because women are mystified that useless and charming qualities such as their modesty, pride, and extreme delicacy flourish. In one sense, these are defects. They lead to lies, susceptibilities, and anger, but they can be explained by the situation in which women are placed. It leads them to taking pride in little things, or at least things determined by feeling, because all the supposedly important objects are out of their reach. Their modesty results from the dependence they suffer." And another way, this again just comes through a lot of the book for talking about a lot of the different stages of a woman's life, but for many women, the roads to transcendence are blocked. Because they do nothing, they do not make themselves be anything. They wonder indefinitely what they could have become, which leads them to wonder what they are. It is a useless questioning. If man fails to find that secret essence, it is simply because it does not exist. Kept at the margins of the world, woman cannot be defined objectively through this world, and her mystery conceals nothing but emptiness. Here we get zinger number 3 against Christianity. Angels have no sex, according to theologians, but they have masculine names and are shown as handsome young men. God's emissaries on earth, the Pope, the bishop whose ring is kissed, the priest who says Mass, the preacher, the person who kneels before in the secrecy of the confessional, are all men. This is a really interesting one, and I kind of just want to say it and almost get your thoughts or let it stew in your head, because she has a big section where she's talking about the concept of the lesbian and homosexuality, and she writes this about homosexual men. "The homosexual man inspires hostility from male and female heterosexuals as they both demand that man be a dominating subject. By contrast, both sexes spontaneously view lesbians with indulgence." In a section talking about the married woman and about how women sort of try to, like, because they're kind of confined to the home, they try to create a kingdom within that home. "But to find a home in oneself, one must first have realized oneself in works or acts. Man only has a middling interest in his domestic interior because he has access to the entire universe and because he can affirm himself in his projects. Woman, instead, is locked into the conjugal community. She has to change this prison into a kingdom." And another core thesis within the married women section is just how the thing that burns on women who are stuck in this thing is boredom. And she's talking about doing housework, and she writes, "Women and men writers can lyrically exalt these triumphs because they never or rarely do housework. Done every day, this work becomes monotonous and mechanical. It is laden with waiting for the water to boil, for the roast to be cooked just right, for the laundry to dry. Even if different tasks are well organized, there are long moments of passivity and emptiness. Most of the time they are accomplished in boredom, between present life and the life of tomorrow." One of the things that can be hard to hear because you realize that you're the problem, but de Beauvoir kind of lays it out and lays out the conflict where she says, "If it is said men oppress women, the husband reacts indignantly. He feels oppressed, and he is. But in fact, it is the masculine code, the society developed by males and in their interest, that has defined the feminine condition in a form that is now for both sexes a source of distress." And again, this is weird. It literally is the exact same thing that is said or mentioned today, talking about the right to have an abortion. "It must be pointed out that the same society so determined to defend the rights of the fetus shows no interest in children after they are born. Instead of trying to reform this scandalous institution called public assistance, society prosecutes abortionists. Those responsible for delivering orphans to torturers are left free. Society closes its eyes to the horrible tyranny practiced in reform schools or in the private homes of child abusers. And while it refuses to accept that the fetus belongs to the mother carrying it, it nevertheless agrees that the child is his parents' thing." In this section talking about the mother, she talks about how there can sometimes be an animosity that mothers feel for their children because they are often manifestations of making them realize the destiny and realizing that sometimes it's not always sunshine and roses to have a child and to raise a child, and that the novelty can wear off pretty quickly. And de Beauvoir writes, the mother's main excuse is that the child is far from bringing her the satisfying self-accomplishment she was promised since childhood. She takes out on him the mystification of which she was a victim and that the child innocently exposes. And then in the same section talking about the mother, when the mother has had a daughter who is kind of getting around the age 10, 11, 12, for what vexes her the most is that she does not have any real superiority to set against the girl of 11 or 12. The latter can already perform household tasks perfectly well. She is a little woman. She even has a liveliness, curiosity, and lucidity that, in many regards, makes her superior to the adult woman. And this is a really great way of just summing up the kind of in a similar way of Virginia Woolf talking about the hypothetical Shakespeare's sister. De Beauvoir writes, it is man's luck in adulthood as in childhood to be made to take the most arduous roads but the surest ones. Woman's misfortune is that she is surrounded by nearly irresistible temptations. Everything incites her to take the easy way out. Instead of being encouraged to fight on her own account, she is told that she can let herself get by and she will reach enchanted paradises. When she realizes she was fooled by a mirage, it is too late. She has been worn out in this adventure. And then, so like earlier on, I was talking about how some of the things later on maybe just refer to talking about how any of us nowadays try to create work in this sort of hyper commodified modern world. She writes, maybe just, I'll read this first example, and then the other one is one where you can swap out, or you can almost just swap out the phrase woman with like the modern writer. To please, and so in this context, she's talking about how some women like only dabble with arts, but they're not kind of committed to the craft and the trade of really making something lasting. She says, to please, one needs only to create mirages, but a work of art is not a mirage. It is a solid object. To construct it, one must know one's craft. It is not only thanks to her gifts or personality that Colette became a great writer. Her pen was often her livelihood, and she demanded of it the careful work that a good artisan demands of his tool. And then here's that next example of talking about, whenever people have a very romantic idea of writing, like I want to write something and I just want it to be great. She writes, unfortunately, spontaneity is not as simple as it appears. The paradox of the commonplace is that it is nothing more than the immediate translation of the subjective impression. Thus, when the woman produces the image she creates without taking others into account, she thinks she is most unusual, but she is merely reinventing a banal cliché. If she is told, she is surprised and vexed and throws down her pen. She is not aware that the public reads with its own eyes and its own mind, and that a brand new epithet can awaken in it old memories. Of course, it is a precious gift to be able to dig down into oneself and bring up vibrant impressions to the surface of language. But although those two terms seem to contradict each other, Colette's spontaneity is a thoughtful spontaneity. She refuses some of its contributions and accepts others as she sees fit. The amateur, rather than seizing words as an inter-individual relation and appeal to the other, sees in them the direct revelation of her feelings. Editing or crossing out for her means repudiating a part of self. She does not want to sacrifice anything, both because she delights in what she is and because she hopes not to become other. Which is really crazy thinking about just translating that to modern writing and like trying to write this idea of, I want to write things that are sincere, and so sincere things should come easy, but then it's like just being sincere and pouring your heart out doesn't intrinsically make something worthwhile. All in all, it was a pretty trippy experience reading The Second Sex, and I think that there is definitely, highlights, of course, but as I always tend to do with these books, I just kind of read them cover to cover, which I guess I can also recommend for you. I would love to know what your opinions are, and especially for any women and female viewers, I would love to know how this strikes you and how you think it's aged compared to your contemporary experience. For men, I recommend of course, reading The Second Sex. And yeah, thank you again for watching this long video. I'm still trying to figure out the framing, but yeah, we'll make it work, and I'll see you all in the next one.